The wind carried dust across the barren road, swirling it into the air as if the land itself was restless. The sun had begun to sink low, turning the sky into streaks of red and gold, yet its heat still burned sharp against the skin. The sound of leather creaking hooves, striking hard earth, and voices filled with impatience echoed through the small settlement on the edge of Apache land. It was the kind of place where law meant little, where a man's strength or cruelty often counted for more than justice. Folks lived with watchful eyes, keeping their heads down, afraid to cross the wrong men. At the heart of the crowd, a young woman stood trembling, her wrists bound, her dress torn at the seams from rough handling. She had been pulled from her wagon earlier that day, accused of trespassing on land claimed by a wealthy rancher. The charge itself was thin, but in towns like this, accusations did not need to hold weight. She was alone, far from home, her family long gone, her survival depending on what mercy she could find among strangers. The men around her had little mercy to give. Their laughter was hard, their faces drawn by sun and greed, their eyes fixed on her as though she were nothing more than property. The rancher at the center of it all was a tall man with a whip coiled in his hand. He wore fine clothes dusted from the trail, his boots polished even in the rough dirt. And he carried himself as one who believed everything around him was his to own. His voice cut through the air, sharp and mocking, as he declared her guilty of trespassing. The crowd gave no protest. No one dared to speak against him. He raised the whip in his hand, a cruel smile tugging at his lips, ready to strike, to leave his mark on her as a warning to others who might think of defying his claim. The woman braced herself, her breath shallow, her body tense. The sound of leather snapping against the air made her flinch. She closed her eyes, expecting pain, humiliation, perhaps the start of something worse. Yet the blow never landed. Instead, a voice rose, deep and unyielding, stronger than the rancher's cruelty. Every head turned toward the edge of the crowd. Standing there, framed against the dying light of the sky, was an Apache warrior. His figure was tall and commanding, his chest broad, muscles marked with faint tribal patterns, his stance rooted like a tree that could not be moved. He wore traditional jewelry, beads, and leather that carried the story of his people, and his dark eyes burned with fire. A feathered headdress crowned his head, catching the last of the sun's glow, making him seem almost otherworldly to those who had never seen such strength and spirit gathered in one man. He stepped forward with quiet power, each stride deliberate, forcing the crowd to part as though the earth itself demanded space for him. The rancher froze, his whip still raised, but his smirk faltered. The warrior did not need to shout to command attention. His very presence silenced the air, leaving only the sound of the wind whispering against the wooden posts and the shuffle of uneasy boots. The woman lifted her eyes, disbelief written on her face. In a place where no one had spoken for her, where fear had swallowed every voice, here was a man who dared to stand in her defense. He reached her side, and with one motion, pulled the whip from the rancher's grip and tossed it to the ground. The gasps from the crowd spread quickly. To lay a hand on that rancher, to strip him of control, was an act few would dare. Then came the words, steady and sharp, carrying through the silence like a strike of thunder. He declared in a tone that held no room for argument, "She belongs to me." The weight of those words hung in the air. Some took it as a claim of protection, others as a challenge. And a few whispered that it was the beginning of war between two worlds that had long distrusted each other. The rancher's face darkened, rage flaring in his eyes. He had been humiliated in front of his men, stripped of power in a single moment. Yet the warrior's gaze held firm, daring him to test his resolve. The woman's chest rose and fell rapidly as she tried to understand what had just happened. She was free from the whip, yet now bound to a man whose strength commanded respect and fear. She knew nothing of him, not even his name, only that he had stepped into danger for her sake. But questions stirred inside her heart. Why would an Apache warrior, feared by settlers and misunderstood by ranchers, risk himself for a stranger? Was this an act of mercy, or had she just been pulled from one chain into another? The rancher spat on the ground, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "You think you can walk in here into my town and take what is mine? You'll regret this." His hand drifted toward the pistol at his side, but the warrior's stance shifted slightly, warning him that a single move could turn the dust red. Tension rippled through the crowd, fear mixing with fascination. No one dared to breathe too loudly. Men who had laughed moments ago now stood still, caught between loyalty to the rancher and respect for the strength before them. The woman's heart pounded, her thoughts racing as she tried to imagine what would happen next. The sky grew darker, shadows stretching long across the dirt, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath. The warrior turned slightly toward her, his eyes meeting hers with a steadiness that unsettled her. There was no cruelty there, only certainty, as if he already knew the path he had chosen. She felt the weight of those words again. "She belongs to me," echoing inside her. The rancher's men shifted uneasily, their hands hovering near weapons, waiting for a signal. The townsfolk edged back, afraid of being caught in the middle of something larger than themselves. Every heartbeat stretched longer. Every second felt like the space before lightning strikes the ground. The woman tried to speak, but her voice caught in her throat. What could she say? She was torn between fear of what she had escaped and fear of what lay ahead. For the first time, her fate was not in the hands of those who sought to harm her, but in the hands of someone who might be her salvation or her greatest danger. And then, in that stillness, the rancher's hand twitched toward his pistol, his jaw clenched in fury, his pride demanding blood. The Apache warrior's stance tightened, ready for what was coming, his body like coiled steel, his eyes burning with unshakable resolve. The crowd leaned forward, caught between terror and wonder. The woman's breath trembled as she realized the next moment could decide everything: her freedom, her survival, and perhaps even the beginning of a war no one could stop. The air itself seemed to break with the weight of what was about to happen, and as the warrior stepped closer, his shadow falling over her, she knew her life would never again be the same. The silence in that dusty street felt heavier than chains. Men shifted their boots, horses snorted as if restless with the tension, and the woman stood frozen between fear and disbelief. The Apache warrior had spoken with such certainty that it seemed to shake the ground itself, yet no one knew what would happen next. The rancher's hand hovered near his pistol, his pride demanding a fight, but his mind weighing the risk. The crowd could almost hear the rancher's heart pounding, just as they could feel the fire burning in the warrior's eyes. The young woman's breath came fast. She had been bracing for the whip, for the sting of leather across her back. And now she was standing behind a man whose very presence defied the cruelty of this settlement. She studied him, trying to understand who he was. His clothes were simple, but carried the strength of his people beads strung carefully, a necklace carved from bone, leather worn, but sturdy. His chest bore faint marks, not scars of punishment, but symbols inked into his skin, patterns that seemed older than the land around them. He was no ordinary man, not by any measure. The rancher finally spoke, his voice low with rage. "This isn't your land. This isn't your woman. You come into my town, and you'll pay for it." His words were meant to strike fear, yet they cracked slightly under the weight of humiliation.
Ow.
The warrior gave no answer. He stood tall, his silence sharper than any insult, his grip tight on the whip he had stripped away, before tossing it into the dirt like it was nothing but useless leather. The crowd whispered, torn between curiosity and dread. Some settlers muttered about the dangers of angering the Apache, telling themselves this man was nothing more than a savage stepping into matters that weren't his. Others kept their eyes down, knowing deep inside that cruelty had finally been challenged, though they feared to admit it. There were children peeking from behind doorframes, women clutching their shawls tight, and old men leaning on their canes with grim expressions. They all knew this moment would not end quietly. The woman's thoughts ran wild. Why had he stepped in? She had no family here, no kin to protect her, no allies among the settlers. She had learned to keep her head bowed, her words soft, to avoid drawing the wrong kind of attention. Yet here was this warrior, risking his life for someone he did not know. His words still echoed in her mind. "She belongs to me." The way he said it carried no cruelty, yet it bound her in a way that frightened her. Did it mean safety, or did it mean another kind of captivity? The rancher's men stood restless, waiting for a signal. Their loyalty was not born of respect, but of dependence. They lived under his pay, his power, his reach. Still they hesitated, because to move against this Apache meant stepping into a fight none of them were sure they could win. The warrior carried no gun, but his hands alone promised more danger than bullets. The rancher's pride, however, was not so easily silenced. He lowered his hand from the pistol, but took a step closer. His face inches from the warrior's. "You've made a mistake you won't live long to regret," he hissed. The warrior did not flinch, did not blink. Instead, his words came steady once more. "A mistake is raising a whip against a woman who cannot fight back." His tone was not loud, yet every ear heard it. It was the kind of truth that cut deeper than any blade. The woman's chest tightened. For the first time in years, someone had spoken aloud the injustice she had endured silently. She had felt small, powerless, pushed from one hardship to another since she lost her kin. But standing beside this man, she felt something new, an ember of defiance she thought she had lost. The tension broke when the rancher finally stepped back. His fury was not gone, only delayed. He barked at his men, ordering them to stand down, though his eyes promised revenge. "This isn't over," he growled. With that, he turned and stormed off, his boots kicking up dust, his men trailing behind him with reluctant steps. The crowd slowly began to disperse, but their whispers carried into the night. A storm had been born in that street, and everyone knew it. The woman remained where she was, her wrists still bound, her heart hammering. The warrior cut the ropes with a swift motion of his knife, his movements sharp but careful. She rubbed her wrists, the skin red and tender, and looked up at him. His face was calm, but his eyes held layers she could not yet read. Gratitude caught in her throat, but the words felt too small for what he had done. Before she could speak, he said quietly, "You are safe now." Safe. The word echoed strangely inside her. Safe from the whip, yes, but safe in the long run. She was not sure. Settlers feared the Apache, and ranchers saw them as enemies. To stand beside him was to carry the weight of that tension. She glanced around, noticing the eyes that still watched from behind cracked shutters. They would speak of this night, twist it into stories, spread it until every ear heard of the woman claimed by a warrior. The warrior guided her gently away from the center of town. Each step felt uncertain, yet her feet followed without protest. He did not speak much, but his silence carried strength, as if he measured every word carefully. The sky had grown darker, stars pricking through the horizon, the moon climbing higher with quiet grace. The night air was cooler, brushing against her skin, calming her after the storm of fear. As they walked, her thoughts tangled like wild branches. She wondered about his people, about the stories that had been told in hushed, fearful tones around campfires. Settlers painted the Apache as fierce and merciless, raiders who struck without warning, but looking at him, she saw something different. There was fierceness, yes, but it was not cruelty. It was the strength of someone who carried honor in his blood, who stood against wrong even when it placed him in danger. She longed to ask him why he had helped her, why he had risked angering men who held power in this town. But fear kept her tongue still. Instead, she watched him quietly, noticing the way he moved, the way his eyes searched the land as if he could read it like a map. He seemed to belong to the earth itself, to the wind, the stones, the silence of the desert. The woman's memories tugged at her as they left the glow of the settlement behind. She remembered her family's wagon collapsing under the weight of storms, her mother's fading smile, her father's rough hands guiding the reins. She remembered hunger gnawing at her, the endless days of labor under men who cared only for what they could take. Now she was in the hands of someone she did not understand, and yet deep inside, something told her she was better off than she had been only hours before. They reached a clearing at the edge of the desert, where a fire burned low among stones. The warrior's horse grazed nearby, a powerful animal with eyes that glinted in the firelight. He motioned for her to sit, and she obeyed, her dress torn, but her spirit slowly gathering itself. The flames cast shadows across his face, making him look both ancient and unshakable, like he had stepped out of a story told under the stars. At last, she found the courage to speak. "Why did you stop him?" Her voice trembled, carrying both fear and gratitude. The warrior stirred the fire with a stick, sparks rising into the night. His answer was simple, yet heavy with meaning, because it was wrong. The simplicity of those words struck her harder than any speech could have. In a world where men twisted truth for power, where cruelty went unchecked, here was a man who saw wrong and did not turn away. She wrapped her arms around herself, unsure what tomorrow would bring, but knowing tonight she had been spared from something that could have broken her spirit forever. Still, the danger was far from gone. The rancher would not forget this insult, and neither would his men. Their pride had been wounded in front of the whole town. Revenge was a hunger that never slept. She realized then that her fate was now tied not only to herself but to this warrior who had claimed her as his. The fire crackled, the desert wind whispered, and the night stretched on. She watched him in silence, her questions burning like the embers before her, knowing answers would come in time. But even as exhaustion pulled at her, one truth remained sharp. Her life had changed in that single moment when he stepped between her and the whip. What awaited her now was unknown, perhaps even more dangerous than what she had faced before. Yet for the first time she felt a spark of hope flicker inside her. Even as the shadows of vengeance grew long across the desert, the fire burned low in the clearing, its glow soft against the cold desert night. The woman sat with her knees pulled close, her eyes shifting off into the warrior across from her. He said little, his gaze steady on the horizon, as if he could hear things far beyond her reach. Silence stretched between them, filled only with the crackle of wood and the restless stirring of the wind. She wanted to ask more, to understand why he had spoken for her so boldly, but fear of the answers kept her quiet. Every now and then, the sound of a coyote rose in the distance, reminding her they were far from safety. Her hands still bore marks from the rope, thin red lines that throbbed under her touch. She rubbed them absently, her thoughts tangled with memories of the rancher's eyes filled with rage. She knew him well enough to know he would not forget the humiliation of that moment. If anything, his pride would drive him to seek her out, to punish her and the man who had interfered. That certainty weighed on her heavier than the night air. The warrior finally spoke, his voice deep and calm. "You should rest. Tomorrow will be harder than today." She wanted to believe him, but his tone carried a warning that unsettled her. Harder in what way? Would the rancher send his men after them? Would the settler see her as a traitor for leaving with him? Questions piled high in her mind, but before she could shape them into words, he rose to his feet and walked a short distance away, keeping watch as if danger might come at any moment. Her body trembled, not only from the chill but from the storm inside her. She thought of her past, of the nights when she had clung to hope that someone would protect her, only to wake each morning to the same cruel world. Now, when protection had finally come, it came in the form of someone settlers had taught her to fear. She had heard stories of raids, of warriors who took what they wanted and left ruin behind. Yet this man had stopped the whip, not raised it. He had claimed her, but not with violence. Instead, he had spoken words that bound her to him in the eyes of everyone who had watched. As the fire dimmed, she lay down, wrapping her arms around herself. Sleep came in uneasy fragments, broken by dreams of leather cracking in the air, and the warrior's voice declaring she belonged to him. Each time she woke, she found him nearby, standing tall against the night, his presence both strange and steady. When morning broke, the desert stretched wide around them, glowing under the rising sun. The warrior had already prepared his horse and offered her a piece of dried meat without a word. Hunger forced her to take it, though she found herself watching his every move, searching for clues about his thoughts. He rode with silence, guiding her through narrow paths along the rocks. Always alert, his eyes scanning the land as if he knew it would soon turn against them. Back in town, the rancher's fury boiled like a pot left too long over flame. He paced the floor of his ranch house, his boots striking hard against the wood, his men gathered like restless hounds. His pride had been cut in front of everyone, and that kind of wound festered. "No Apache walks into my town and shames me," he spat, slamming his fist against the table. "He'll pay, and so will she." His men nodded, though some exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen the warrior's strength, felt the weight of his stare. They were loyal to the rancher, but none of them forgot how quickly fear had silenced them the night before. Among them was a younger hand, quieter than the rest. He had seen the woman's face when the whip was raised, seen her terror, and something in him had twisted. He had grown up watching men like the rancher rule through fear, and he wondered if maybe this time the rancher had gone too far. Still, he kept his thoughts to himself, knowing a single word out of place could mark him as weak. Yet, deep down, he could not shake the image of the warrior standing between cruelty and innocence. The rancher began gathering more men, spreading word through nearby settlements. He told them lies to fuel their anger, painting the Apache as a savage who had kidnapped the woman against her will, who threatened the safety of the entire town. The settlers, already wary of the Apache, needed little pushing to believe him. Fear was an easy weapon, and the rancher wielded it well. Soon, whispers turned into plans, and plans turned into weapons being sharpened. Meanwhile, the woman traveled with the warrior into lands that grew wilder the farther they went. She saw canyons carved by rivers, mesas rising like silent giants, and wide stretches of desert that glowed under the sun. The world beyond the settlement was harsh but alive, and she realized how little she had known of it. The warrior moved with a grace that made her feel clumsy in comparison. He knew which plants could be eaten, which tracks belonged to deer, and which shadows meant danger. She began to sense that to him, the land was not an enemy, but an ally. Her fear of him slowly shifted into something more complicated. At times, she caught him watching her, his eyes filled with thought she could not read. There was no malice in his stare, but there was weight, as if he carried burdens beyond her understanding. She longed to ask about his people, his life, the battles he had fought, but his silence held her back. Instead, she learned by watching the way he honored the fire before leaving, the way he treated his horse with respect, the way he touched the earth as though it carried voices only he could hear. One evening, as the sky turned shades of orange, he finally spoke more than a few words. "The rancher will come. He will not forgive what happened." She swallowed hard, her heart tightening at the truth she already knew. "Why risk it?" she asked softly. "Why put yourself against him for me?" He looked into the distance before answering, because no man should raise a whip to a woman, because your fate was not his to decide. His voice carried the weight of conviction, and though it did not answer every question, it gave her a piece of the truth she had been searching for. But danger was already moving closer. The rancher had sent scouts ahead, men who knew the desert well enough to follow tracks. They rode fast, carrying the rancher's orders to find the warrior and bring the woman back, dead or alive if need be. One of those scouts, the younger hand, felt unease twisting inside him with every mile. He had no love for the Apache, but he could not erase the memory of the rancher's whip ready to strike. Each hoofbeat carried him closer to a choice he did not yet realize he would have to make. The woman, sensing the shadow of pursuit, grew restless at night. She asked the warrior what would happen if the rancher caught them, but his only reply was, "He will not." His certainty steadied her, but in her heart. She knew men like the rancher did not let go so easily. As they moved deeper into Apache land, she began to notice signs of others' camps left behind, markings on rocks, faint trails that told stories she could not read. She wondered if they were leading her toward his people, if she would soon stand before those she had been taught to fear. The thought both frightened and intrigued her. Would they see her as a stranger, an intruder, or would they accept her because he had claimed her? The warrior's silence left much to mystery, and the weight of that mystery pressed against her each day. She knew so little of him, yet her life was tied to his now. And the more they traveled, the more she realized she had stepped into a world beyond the rules of the settlement, beyond the cruelty of ranchers, into something larger and more dangerous. Back at the rancher's homestead, the fire of vengeance burned hotter. He gathered men, weapons, and anger, weaving a tale that made the settlers feel they were fighting not only for pride but for survival. He swore the Apache warrior would pay, and he swore the woman would be brought back. His voice carried like thunder through the saloon, through the bunkhouses, through the hearts of men too eager for a fight. The woman felt the pull of that storm even from miles away. Each step forward was a step closer to confrontation, though she did not know where it would happen or how it would end. All she knew was that the desert held its breath, waiting for the clash of pride, vengeance, and honor. And caught in the center of it, her fate hung fragile, uncertain, tied to the choices of men who refused to bow. The days that followed carried a strange weight, like the land itself was waiting for something to break. The woman rode behind the warrior across endless stretches of desert, her hands gripping the saddle as the wind stung her face. Each night, when they stopped to rest, she listened for sounds beyond the fire, wondering if the rancher's men were already close. Da-da-da-da-da. Sleep never came easily, and when it did, it was filled with dreams of leather snapping and shadows closing in. The warrior spoke little, yet his silence said much. His eyes searched the horizon constantly, his ears tuned to every shift of the wind, every rustle of brush. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand often lingered near the knife at his side. He knew as well as she did that they were being followed. Still, he moved with calm steadiness, as though he had already prepared himself for whatever storm was coming. One evening, as the sun bled red into the sky, they stopped near a shallow canyon. The warrior built a small fire, its glow reflecting in his eyes. She sat nearby, her thoughts heavy, the silence between them stretching. Finally, she asked, "Will your people help us?" Her voice was soft, uncertain. He looked at her for a long moment before answering. "If we reach them, yes. But the path there is not safe." The words sent a chill through her. She realized he was not only protecting her from the rancher, but also from the dangers of the land itself. Each day carried the weight of both man and wilderness pressing against them. She wanted to ask him why he had chosen this burden, why her life had mattered enough to risk his own, but the question caught in her throat. Instead, she held her silence, knowing answers would only come in their own time. Far behind them, the rancher's pursuit grew more determined. He had gathered a dozen men armed with rifles and pistols, their horses carrying them hard across the desert. Dust rose behind them like smoke from a fire that refused to die. His fury drove them on, his pride refusing to let the insult go unpunished. Around campfires at night, his men whispered their doubts, but no one dared speak against him. He promised gold, land, and revenge, and those promises were enough to keep them riding. Among the riders, the younger hand felt unease, pressing deeper into his chest. He remembered the woman's eyes, the way she had trembled before the whip. Each mile closer to the warrior felt like a mile closer to something he could not escape. The others spoke of catching her, of punishing the Apache, of proving their strength. But he could not shake the sense that they were chasing something more dangerous than they understood. Back in the desert, the woman began noticing changes in the warrior. He had always carried himself with strength, but now his silence was sharper, his movements quicker. He no longer built fires as high, and he often doubled back to cover their tracks. One night, he woke her with a hand on her shoulder, his voice low. "They are close." She sat up, fear gripping her, and looked into the darkness. The wind carried faint sounds hooves in the distance, the crack of a branch under weight. Her heart raced. They left quickly, their horse carrying them into the night. The desert stretched endless, stars glowing above like cold, watchful eyes. She clung to him tightly, the rhythm of the horse pounding through her bones. Each sound behind them made her breath catch, each shadow seemed to move. The chase had truly begun. For days it went on, a cruel game of distance. Sometimes the rancher's men were far behind, their dust cloud faint on the horizon. Other times the woman swore she could hear their voices carried by the wind. The warrior never faltered. He guided them through rocky paths, narrow canyons, and dry riverbeds, using the land itself as their shield. But each turn of the trail brought new risks. At one point, they came upon the remains of an old camp, broken pottery and charred stones left behind. The warrior paused, kneeling to touch the earth. His face grew solemn. "This was once my people's ground," he said quietly. The woman watched him, sensing the weight of history in his voice. She wanted to ask what had happened here, but before she could, he rose swiftly, his head turning. The sound of riders echoed faintly through the canyon walls. The chase was tightening. That night, they did not sleep. The warrior kept them moving, their horse climbing steep ridges until the land opened wide again. The woman's body ached, her hands raw from gripping leather, but fear pushed her forward. She thought of the rancher's face, twisted with rage, and knew what would happen if he caught her. Yet part of her feared what would happen even if they reached the warrior's people. Now, would they accept her? Or would she be seen as an intruder, tied to a man who had claimed her in front of settlers? The closer they drew to the warrior's land, the more the tension grew. Signs of the rancher's men appeared, hoofprints fresh in the dirt, a broken branch. The smell of smoke carried on the air. The warrior's jaw tightened each time he saw them, his silence growing heavier. The woman sensed the weight on him, the knowledge that he carried not only his own fate, but hers as well. Meanwhile, the rancher drove his men harder. His pride burned hotter with each mile, each delay only fueling his anger. Told himself he would see the Apache dead at his feet. The woman dragged back to face the punishment she deserved for daring to defy him. His men grew weary, but his fire kept them bound to him. Only the younger hand hesitated, his doubts growing louder with each passing day. At last the land began to change. The woman noticed markings on the rocks, faint carvings worn by time. The warrior touched them as they passed, his expression unreadable. She realized they were nearing his people, though what waited ahead was still uncertain. Yet before they could reach safety, the sounds of pursuit grew closer, louder, undeniable. The rancher's men were closing in. The warrior led her to higher ground, a ridge overlooking the wide stretch of desert. From there she could see the dust of riders in the distance, the faint shimmer of rifles in the sun. Her stomach dropped, fear wrapping tight around her chest. She turned to him, her voice trembling. "What will happen when they find us?" He looked at her, his dark eyes steady. "They will come, and we will stand." The words sent a shiver through her. There was no hint of fear in his tone, only certainty. Yet the certainty itself terrified her. The rancher's men were many, and he was only one man. She could not imagine how they would survive. Still, something inside her sparked with the same fire that burned in him. For the first time, she felt that maybe her life was not only about running or bowing her head, maybe it was about standing too. The rancher's men pressed closer, their shouts carrying faintly through the air. The warrior positioned her carefully behind him, his body a shield, his stance unyielding.
Ow!
The woman's hand shook, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break her ribs. The air itself felt charged, heavy with the promise of violence. On the horizon, the riders appeared, their figures sharp against the fading light. The rancher led them, his face twisted with determination, his pistol gleaming at his side. He raised his hand, signaling the men to spread out, to surround. The woman felt her throat tighten, her breath shallow. This was at the moment the chase had been leading to, the moment where pride, vengeance, and survival would collide. The warrior stood firm, his shadow long in the setting sun. The woman gripped her dress tightly, her body trembling, her mind racing. The rancher's men closed in, their voices rising, their weapons ready. The desert held its breath, the world pausing on the edge of something that could not be undone. And in that stillness, she realized everything, her past, her fears. Her hope was about to crash into the fire of what was coming. The echo of the last gunshot still lingered in the air, its sharp sound bouncing off the canyon walls like a bitter reminder of how close everything had come to breaking apart. The Apache warrior stood firm, his chest rising and falling with each deep breath, his dark eyes scanning the dust and smoke that had yet to settle. She stood only a few steps behind him, trembling but upright, her hands clenched tight as though letting go would mean the ground itself would pull her under. She knew what had just happened could have ended so differently, and the weight of that thought pressed heavy against her heart. The men who had come to claim her were gone, driven off in defeat, their pride wounded more than their bodies. Yet victory did not feel like celebration. The Apache knew this fight had only bought them time, not peace. He declared before the world that she belonged to him, but with that claim came responsibility and danger alike. His people would question him, the settlers would brand him a thief, and the men who had been humiliated would surely return with more strength. He looked back at her then, not with the fire of battle still in his veins, but with a quieter intensity, as though he wanted her to understand what his choice meant for both of them. She met his gaze, and for the first time since the nightmare had begun, her fear shifted into something else. Gratitude, confusion, and a strange, unshakable trust swirled together inside her. She could not explain why she believed in him, but she did. His words, his protection, his very presence felt like a shield between her and a world that had done her nothing but harm. And yet she also knew that their lives had now been tied together in ways neither of them had planned. The camp was restless that night. Fires burned low, shadows stretched long, and voices carried in hushed tones. Some of his people wondered if the warrior had acted too boldly, if declaring her as his would invite storms upon them all. Others saw his act as a sign of strength, proof that he would not bend to the cruelty of outsiders. But no matter what side they took, no one could deny that something had shifted. She felt the weight of their stares as she moved through the camp, unsure where she fit in, yet knowing that the eyes that lingered on her also carried curiosity, not just judgment. The Apache warrior stayed close, speaking little, his silence saying more than words could have. He had chosen a path that could not be undone, and though his heart carried the courage to face it, he wondered if hers could do the same. At times he would glance at her, his features unreadable, as though trying to gauge if she regretted what had happened or if she would walk beside him in this uncertain road. As days passed, the land itself seemed to reflect the tension they carried. The wind carried dust that stung the skin, and the sun beat down mercilessly, but the nights were cold and sharp, forcing them to huddle closer to the fire. She learned more about him during those quiet moments, when the roar of battle and the whispers of doubt were far away. He spoke of his people, of how every choice was a thread woven into the larger cloth of their survival. He told her of the sacred bond they shared with the earth, the rivers, the stars above. She listened, soaking in each word, realizing how different his world was from hers, yet how much sense it made when he explained it. In turn, she shared pieces of her own past. The hardships, the loneliness, the cruelty she had endured under men who saw her as less than human. She told him of the nights she had prayed for someone to see her worth, for someone to fight for her instead of against her. His silence as she spoke was not distant, but heavy with understanding. When she faltered, his steady gaze urged her on, as if he were lifting the weight of her words onto his own shoulders. But even as their bond grew, the danger grew sharper. The men who had been driven away were not gone for good. Riders were seen in the distance, circling like vultures waiting for weakness. The warriors' people prepared for what might come, sharpening weapons, strengthening defenses, but also carrying unease in their hearts. They knew they would not be left alone, not after such a public defiance. One night, when the firelight flickered low and the stars stretched endless above, she asked him what it meant when he declared she belonged to him. Her voice trembled, not from fear of him, but from the need to know if she was more than a claim, shouted in defiance. He turned his head slowly, his dark eyes catching the firelight. "It meant no man would lay a hand on you," he said, his voice low, almost a growl. "It meant you were under my protection, no matter what comes. But it does not mean chains. It does not mean silence. It means I stand with you, even when the world stands against us." The truth in his words settled deep inside her, chasing away doubts she hadn't spoken aloud. She realized then that what he offered was not ownership but a bond, one that carried risk and sacrifice on both sides. For the first time in years, she felt the stirrings of hope, fragile but real. Yet their hope was tested sooner than either expected. One morning, as dawn painted the horizon in red and gold, a rider came fast into the camp, his horse lathered with sweat. He brought news that the men who had been defeated were gathering again, not far away, and they would return with more than whips this time. They would come with rifles, anger, and the law twisted to their favor. The camp erupted in debate, some arguing they should leave, others saying they must fight. She watched the warrior as he listened, his jaw tight, his hands resting on the knife at his side. His people looked to him for guidance, but she could see the storm behind his calm face. He was not only deciding for himself now, but for her too, for all of them. That night, as the camp prepared for what lay ahead, she found herself unable to sleep. She rose and walked a little way from the fire, the cool air biting her skin, the silence pressing in around her. She thought of the life she had left behind, the chains she had escaped, the pain she had endured. And then she thought of him, the man who had stepped between her and the whip, who had spoken words that changed everything. When he found her standing there, staring out into the endless dark, he did not speak at first, simply stood beside her, their shoulders almost touching, his presence grounding her. At last he said, "Whatever comes, you are not alone." Her eyes filled, not with fear this time, but with something stronger. She nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "And neither are you." The night stretched on, heavy with anticipation. Every rustle of leaves, every distant cry of a coyote felt like a warning. The stars shone cold and sharp, as though bearing witness to the storm about to break. By dawn, the horizon would hold riders, dust, and danger. By dawn, their bond would be tested in fire and blood. And as she stood beside him, the man who had declared her his, in front of the world, she knew that whatever happened, the story of that choice would echo far beyond the coming battle. It was not just about survival now. It was about belonging, about love born in defiance, about two souls who refused to be broken. The sun had not yet risen, but the ground already trembled with the weight of hooves in the distance. The final reckoning was coming, and neither of them could turn away.